Welcome back, Tribe. We're here today with our special guest, Pablo El Diablo Salinas. Pablo, how are you doing today?
Oh, no, not bad. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. I'm doing pretty well. So, Pablo, we got you on today, and we're going to talk about modern self-defense and modern combatives. And I wanted to bring you on, especially because of your background that doesn't involve martial arts as an engineer. You're an engineer by education and by trade, and one of the things that we've kind of talked about before on the program is how a lot of the new programs that you see out there on the market are kind of like soup, in the sense that people kind of slap things together and they don't really have a logic to it. And I thought, well, somebody that I know that has done a good job with putting together a new program, and most definitely probably because he's an engineer, might have some insights as far as how he put his program together and what he had to do to make it functional. So, Pablo, let's delve into that question. But before we do that, give me a brief introduction about yourself and your martial arts background.
Okay, no problem. Basically, like most people, I started martial arts when I was very young. I got exposed to boxing and scientific wrestling, or what's called also catch wrestling. So I grew up in a border town in Mexico, and of course, anybody knowing or growing up in those kind of environments knows that in that kind of situations, you get into a lot of fights. So I had a lot of exposure to fights as a kid, and later on when my family moved to the United States, that's when I started getting into the Eastern martial arts, like most people watching Kung Fu theater, being interested in all that, Kung Fu and being able to walk on walls and climb from tree to tree, very intrigued by that. Of course, I exposed myself to that, but unfortunately, I never got a chance to kind of learn that stuff, so I was a little disappointed, but I was always very interested in the martial arts, so I exposed myself to different various martial arts like judo, Japanese jiu-jitsu. Later on, I got exposed to karate, Okinawan Shorin-ryu. And as I grew up a little bit, and I was already a young adult, that's actually the first time I got exposed to JKD or JKD concept. For me, I was always in search of that myth that was part of the martial arts, and that is to have the ultimate fighting style or system. That's a myth that existed in the martial arts. So I kept to that dream of seeing it, trying to find out whether it was out there, whether it existed, trying to learn all these things. And I wanted to basically create that for myself. I wanted to have that for myself. And I was already contemplating these things of trying to get the best of everything and kind of simulating all this arts that I was being exposed to. And Bruce Lee, when I got exposed to Bruce Lee, it was kind of funny when I got exposed to Bruce Lee's JKD concepts, because he was basically doing the same thing that I was already doing myself. But originally when I got exposed to Bruce Lee, I just thought of him as a movie star. It wasn't until I went to a seminar by Richard Bastille that I realized, oh, there's something here that actually will be functional. And that was always my criticism of some of the Eastern martial arts, that a lot of things that were being taught were not functional. I was a very rational man, very pragmatic man, and I already had been exposed to many fights as a young kid, so I knew what would work and what wouldn't work. And that's kind of how I started pursuing what basically became synergistic martial science. I don't know, does that answer your question?
Oh, definitely. Now, tell us about your martial science. Tell us about how you began to formulate things. What did you choose as your toolbox? What did you choose as the underlying guiding principles of your program?
Well, it needed to be very practical because for me, my interest in martial arts was always to be functional, to be for the purpose of self-defense. Yes, I enjoy the philosophy, I enjoy the art of it. Anything that deals with martial arts, of course, I'm very into. I enjoy it, but ultimately, it needed to be a very functional martial arts. It needed to be for the purpose of defending yourself and your loved one. So what I wanted to basically have is a system that composes of self-defense. And so that was the primary thing, right? So when we think of self-defense, we think of what people kind of get exposed to, especially women. They use them to a seminar. They start off with grabs and wrist locks and chokes and bear hugs and things of that nature. And if you look at traditional martial arts, in the first ranks, that's what they're teaching you. So yes, that's typical self-defense. But then you have to move on beyond that, and you have to be able to learn how to fight. And when we think of fighting, I'm an old school kind of guy. I think of the word brawling. Okay, if I'm brawling, it's going to involve punching, it's going to involve kicking, it's going to involve grappling, and I use the word grappling like the old school guys, which means stand-up wrestling, and of course it needs to involve some wrestling, kind of getting into the ground as well. So that's basically my next base that you need. You need to be able to do brawling, no holds bar, anything goes system. So to have a good, strong base. But like the realities of the streets, you're not going to have a situation where you're just dealing with one opponent. There's going to be multiple opponents, so therefore you have to deal with that situation, that reality, and of course there's weapons. So you have to deal with that situation and that reality. And that's where the next phase is, yes, you have to learn how to fight with impact weapons. You have to learn how to fight with edge weapons. And the other reality of the street, which a lot of traditional martial arts and even contemporary martial arts don't really address it, and that is firearms. You have to address firearms because that is a reality of today's time. So my martial arts composes of all those things: basic self-defense, brawling, or MMA for the streets, if you will, impact weapons, edge weapons, and firearms.
Now, Pablo, you've collected a lot of martial knowledge. You have a collection of techniques in your toolbox, ideas, concepts, tactics on application. As an engineer, and I want to know how your perspective as an engineer guides you through kind of sifting and sorting out all of that material to determine what you're going to deem as useful and promote to other people.
That's a very good question. Basically, yes, it's not a hodgepodge of other martial arts, because then, of course, it will not be functional. It has to be able to flow together. So my ultimate reason for developing this system was never even to basically have it as a public art. I developed this system for my own children. I always thought of this as developing it for myself originally, and then developing it for those that I wanted to pass on to my own family. So the reason that I started putting it out there to the public was because my children are in the autistic spectrum. So I felt like, well, a lot of these things that I'm basically developing, I'm not going to be able to teach to my children. So I should be able to pass it on to other people and have them experience the value of what I've basically put together. And my measure is, can I take this thing that I have, teach it to a woman, and can she be able to use this to defend herself against someone who's bigger and stronger than her? Okay, if I can take someone who's smaller and teach it to this person that is simple enough and be able to utilize it against someone who's bigger and stronger than them, then it is a functional martial art. If it is too complex, that it takes 9 moves to just escape one simple little thing, then of course that's not really a functional thing because you're going to be under stress. So it has to be where it's very simple to actually utilize and be able to teach to someone who's actually smaller than them. And in essence, that is what martial arts was intended for. Martial arts intended for someone who's actually a little bit smaller, not as strong, to be able to have a way to kind of deal with someone who's bigger than them. So I have that as my measure, and I also utilize principles like biomechanics to make things a lot easier, right? And the patterns that I teach are very similar. So if I teach them a certain pattern to defend themselves, that's going to be applicable whether the opponent has no weapons, whether they have a blunt or a stick or an edge weapon. It doesn't really matter. I teach a way that basically simplifies things so that you can be able to do this under stressful situations.
And that's interesting that you mentioned the application, whether it be empty hand or against an armed opponent, because I think a lot of systems will change their game plan based on that. And a lot of times what you can do against an empty hand opponent, even if the angles are similar, somebody taking a big wide swing with an empty hand, it does change when there's a knife in that hand. And that's something that you are, I know from training with you, that you're always very edge aware. Give me your thoughts on that, because like I said, some schools will have techniques for both, and you seem to have only techniques, that are primarily going based off of the most dangerous of the handheld weapons first, and then having it fall into, the empty hand category as kind of an afterthought.
That's correct, and that's kind of my my influence in the Filipino martial arts, which I agree with them. It makes sense, and this is how you kind of synthesize and analyze the situation of various martial arts. You have to be very honest with yourself, of what when you're analyzing these things. You're never necessarily gonna the final product is not necessarily what you wanted. It's basically what's truthful, what's honest. So if I can defeat someone who has a edge weapon, then I should be able to defeat someone who does not have an edge weapon, right? So one is more dangerous than the other. So if someone's attacking you with a knife, for example, then I should be able to do the same similar technique when they don't have a knife, right? So because if it's an ambush type of attack, I don't know whether they have an edge weapon in their hands or it's just their fist. Most people who get attacked with knives, they feel, or they always report that I thought I was just being punched, right? And then it turns out they were being stabbed. So I always treat the hands as though they have basically a knife on them. So I don't let them touch me, right? It's almost like playing that old game when you were a kid, freeze tag. Don't ever let them touch you, right? You have to treat it that way, where the hands are extremely dangerous. I treat them as though there's blades in them, okay? So if I can defeat that, then finding someone who doesn't have an edge weapon is actually a lot easier,
And I think that it's something that people really kind of miss the mark on. And just kind of for illustrative purposes, to give an example, you're walking down the alley, you're turning a corner, and all of a sudden you feel hands on you. You turn and you see this guy moving. Maybe you don't see a punch coming. Now it's not maybe a full punch, fully extended yet, but you see the movement. And somebody that's well trained won't even wait for that punch. They will take action right away. So let's say, you're trained at grappling, and you see that movement coming, so you shoot a double leg, take the guy down. Your game plan is, I'm going to mount him, submit him, control him, knock him out. But what happens if that's a knife? And now you've taken this guy down, and he's flailing his arms around. If it was a punch, it wouldn't do you much damage, but that knife could be puncturing your body with every movement. So I think it's something really important to drive home that being aware of that edge is something that's crucial. Tell me from your experience, especially I know you've worked with law enforcement officers in the past, people that are seeing violence on a more regular basis. Are these lessons that you teach them as well?
That's correct. So I try to teach everyone basically in a similar format, because when I teach police officers, I'm not teaching them as a particular academy and based on them being arrested. I'm teaching them in essence like a citizen, right? So I'm teaching them these skill sets. They of course have to in turn internalize this and apply it for their guidelines, right? So like we said before, like you asked me before, how do I say, okay, this technique doesn't work for me? So you mentioned a double leg takedown. Okay. Well, if I'm already treating you as though you are armed, or you have buddies, me taking the double leg takedown to the ground may be effective if I'm in a elementary school playground and I'm dealing with the school bully. That's fine. But if I'm dealing with something like in a situation where I'm in a dark alley and I don't know if this guy has a weapon and I don't know if he has buddies with him, which chances are he does, that might not be the best move to actually do, right? Because now I just basically pin myself to the ground and his buddies can basically help him out. Or if he had an edge weapon, I just basically did the opposite of what I needed to do for an edge weapon attack, which means in wrestling, you want to get really close to them. Well, in knife fighting, distance is your friend, okay? So that particular move will not be applicable in my system because I purposely took it to the ground. I never purposely take a fight to the ground because I already assume you have a weapon that can kill me, and I already assume that you have buddies. So therefore, the assumption is already that I am dealing with something a lot more high level in threat, right? So therefore, that particular move might not be something that I would want to teach, say, an adult, right? But if I'm teaching kids and they're dealing with a situation that basically is just a bully situation, then yes, that's an important skill set. Now, don't get me wrong, you do have to learn how to wrestle. You do have to learn how to grapple, because if the situation is where they take you to the ground, you have to learn how to transition from that situation, from that position, back to your feet. So therefore, you do have to learn transitions, or what some people call flow. That means being able to move from one position in a wrestling move to another position in a wrestling move, or eventually back to your feet. So there are lessons to learn from every martial art, but don't think that because, yes, it's an important skill set, that every particular technique is going to be valuable to you in a life and death situation.
Now, Pablo, just the idea of walking into any self-defense altercation or situation, assuming that there's multiple attackers and assuming that there are weapons in play, that drastically changes the mindset of how you have to train, and it changes the solutions that you're going to offer. So one thing, and this may sound silly, but I know a lot of martial artists that hold on to ideas, and even though they may be, proven ineffectual, even though they may be proven, incorrect in their application or their understanding of it, they cling to that. They really hold on to that, and it's kind of part of its tradition. It's always been done this way, so I'm going to do it this way. And part of it is something, I don't know, in the human psyche that they just don't want to let go. Have you found yourself having to do that when you're going through your material? Have you found yourself having to let things go? And what were your thoughts on it? How did it make you feel?
Well, personally, it doesn't get into the curriculum until I actually prove that it works. And I've been exposed to many various martial arts in many forms, either by me learning under the particular instructor, attending seminars. Today's time, you are exposed to various types of media to be able to expose yourself to various martial arts. The advantage that I have, if you will, is one, I've been exposed to many fights just growing up in a very bad side of the town, but also I have the mind of a very rational mind that's very analytical. So I analyze everything that I'm exposed to. And in my martial arts, I have excuse my language, but I have what's called the bullshit card. Any of my students can throw the bullshit card and basically say, okay, I'm calling bullshit on this, okay? And the problem is when you throw that card in, then we're going to apply what you thought was nonsense, and we're going to apply it on you and see if it works. And I've had some students believe that certain things did not work, and turns out they did. So I have no problem having my students questioning me to see the validity of any technique. Because, again, my measure, the measure of what I was creating this for was for my own children. So I never wanted to put anything into my system that was not valid, because if I did, then that means I will be teaching things that will be invalid to my own children. So I am the most critical of anyone that I've ever been exposed to as to what I accept as true. Okay, because truth is something that's very dear to me. Okay, so have I been exposed to something in my own system that has been proven invalid? No. Have I had something that, when I'm just in the research phase and trying to analyze things, that's been proven invalid? Yes. I've weeded out so many things before it even gets to my system. So that's my process. I don't accept it until it's tested,
Now, Pablo, another component of modern combatives is obviously weapons. And I think weapons may arguably be the most important part. What are your thoughts on weapons training? You do train in impact weapons. You do train in improvised weapons, edged weapons. Give me an idea of what one of your students can expect to learn as far as your weapons program. Is it something very developed, like a full, system of arnis or Screama, or is this something that's just more bare bones, kind of boot camp military style? What are you teaching people as far as weapons?
That's a very good question. Yes, in Filipino martial arts, again, one of the criticisms will be that they get into very artistic or very convoluted types of drills, and there is some validity to that criticism. You shouldn't develop a drill for the sake of just the drill itself, unless, of course, the drill is not really addressing a combative art, but merely developing attributes, such as, I'm going to go and lift weights. I'm not going to go fight you with weights. I'm just lifting my weights so that I can get stronger, right? So if all you're developing is an attribute, that's fine, as long as the student knows this is for the purpose of developing an attribute, not for the purpose of actually fighting, right? So you have to have a balance, right? And of course, you got to start with the basics. So yes, like many Filipino martial arts, I believe in starting with the 5 basic angles, or the cinco tiros. So those are the most predominant types of angles of attack. So I do enjoy teaching that, and I start with that as well. But eventually, the student gets it. So you have to be able to kind of turn up the knob. So you either turn up the knob in complexity for the purpose of teaching them, okay, now you got to be able to expose yourself to different angles, or you got to turn up the knob also with intensity. So now you're making it more realistic. But just like other criticism that the people have out there, they basically say that some of these drills are dead. There's nothing to it. You're not really learning how to fight that way. So they believe that you should just throw them to the deep end of the water and make them swim. That's also something that I would disagree with, because if you throw someone to the deep end where they're just new, whoever's advanced is always going to win. It doesn't prove anything to the person who's advanced either, because they already know more, right? So all you're doing is basically injuring your student. So there has to be a progression, just like going to school. You're not going to throw someone into calculus 3 when they don't even know how to do fundamental math, right? You have to teach them progression. So that's what I basically do. I start them with something very simple, like the cinco tiros, learning the angles of attack, very slow. Even sometimes I use padded sticks instead of the actual rattan sticks, because it tends to be that the beginning students are the ones that hurt you the most. Okay, so you bring them up through that progression. Once they are comfortable with that, then you start turning up the knob with basically in higher intensity, or the complexity of the angles, or maybe even a complexity of another drill. But just because there's all these drills out there in other systems does not mean that I am going to include that in my system, and that's because some of them are too artsy for me. Okay, they're not very combative, and my focus is more on getting someone to the level where they can be able to utilize this in an actual self-defense situation. So I try to stay away from something that's a little bit too convoluted, and because if it's all for the purpose of a attribute development, you can develop your attributes with other drills that than doing that type of drill. I try to keep it a little bit balanced between simplicity and complexity.
Now, Pablo, with your empty hand and with your weapons training, you mentioned pressure testing. What type of pressure testing do you have the students go through? Are students sparring? Are they doing scenario drills? What's an average class look like at your place?
That's a good question. Normally, we focus, of course, in developing skill sets, because that's what takes the most of the time. Okay. Once they get to a level where they actually feel comfortable, then of course you have to kind of like expose them to different things. Now, sparring, in reality, it doesn't necessarily simulate an actual scenario that you might be exposed to in the street, other than maybe some kind of brawl situation where you basically both agree to get into a fist fight, right? You're looked at each other, say, yeah, okay, let's go. You'll get into a stance and you'll go at it. Well, in many situations, that's not the way it kind of works, because there's all this emotional context where someone's actually in your face and actually getting louder and doing all this cuss words at you. So you have to kind of have a balance between what traditionally was called sparring and situations where you want to do some scenario-based training. Both are good, and both develop different types of awareness and attributes, right? So you need a mixture of both, in my opinion, but you need to have that foundation, right? If you do not have the foundation, then you're not going to be able to respond well to those attacks. And you have to set it up in such a way where not necessarily you're going all out, right? Because you want to be able to analyze the fights or the scenarios and be able to help your students kind of analyze situations and how they can actually do it better. How could they solve this problem, right? Because we're all trying to do is basically solve a problem. And that's where the engineer in me comes out, right? Everything is about problem solving. So you have another problem. How do you fix it? This is how you reacted to the situation. It did not turn out so well. How can we do this better, right? So you do need both in the practice, right? But you need to do it in such a way where the student is still learning.
Now, Pablo, your martial arts, and I don't know if it's best to call it a martial. You refer to it as martial science. But when I think of your program, I don't think of it as a martial art. I think of it as a self-defense system. Tell me some of the things that differentiate, apart from the physical, the punching, the kicking. Apart from the physical, what differentiates a self-defense system from a martial art?
Well, it is, in my opinion, I still consider it martial art because there is an art form to it. Because, yes, in the beginning, your students are going to kind of emulate you and kind of look like you. Like, for example, a lot of people that kind of do Junfen Kung Fu, JKD, which is kind of the classical JKD now. They all kind of look like Bruce Lee. They move like Bruce Lee, right? So in the beginning, that's fine. That's okay. But eventually you want to get your students to kind of think of their own. And what I do is I give them a framework, right? Here's a framework. Here's this framework I developed. So in other words, you can kind of think of it that way as a framework. Now that you have this framework, make it your own, right? You as an individual, you have different attributes. You have different likes and dislikes. As long as you're following these guidelines or principles, right, you can combine things differently to make it your own, right? So when you combine different things in different ways, that's where the individual kind of comes off. So there is an art to it, right? Unless, of course, all you're doing is basically becoming a robot of the teacher, right? If all you're doing is basically becoming a robot of the teacher, then, of course, you neglected the art form, right? So there is an art, and, of course, my system, does have aspects of other things that would be in traditional martial arts, like the philosophy, and all those things, because I happen to also have a philosophy minor as well. But I don't impose that on my students, right? I don't kind of start with that as well, because when someone comes to you, they're coming to you typically for self-defense, right? So you have to give them something right away as to what they're actually there for. So when from day one, the moment you come into my class and you learn self-defense, you're going to get out being able to do that first day. Okay? It's not going to take you 20 years to be able to do something functional. It's going to take you one day, one lesson that's going to be able to give you something that's functional. So there are other aspects to my art, if you will, but you have to give the students what they actually need. So you start with the needs first, right? What do they need, right away? And then develop it from there. Okay?
So, Pablo, speaking of the other things that you incorporate into your training program, as you know, the tribe is dedicated to teaching warriorship on a level that's above, just the physical. What is it, and I'm especially interested because you explained that you developed this originally for your children. So on the spiritual or philosophical side, what is it that you want to instill in your students? Especially because you wanted to instill it in your children originally. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on that.
That's correct. So there are guiding principles out there that if you look at traditional martial arts and again, yeah, I have some criticism of the traditional martial arts, that some of the stuff that they're teaching is not practical for today's street fighting and things of that nature. And yeah, some of it is, of course. But one thing that I give the utmost credit to in traditional martial arts is the martial arts would help me escape the social or financial or economic status that I was born into, right? Because it gave me the discipline, and that self-discipline and that guidance of those principles in traditional martial arts is what actually helped me out. Okay, it was the philosophy of the martial arts that helped me out to escape those settings. So I am fully give complete credit for that, and I am big on those guiding principles. So if you look at traditional martial arts, it has some of those principles embedded in the rituals, such as bowing, respecting other people, respecting your sensei, your sifu, right? Being honest, right? So all those guiding principles is what you have to instill in your students. But because in some of the stuff that we're teaching, or in some of the formats that we're teaching, such as a seminar format, it doesn't lend to that, right? But when you're teaching, when you have regular students on a regular basis, then you can instill some of that philosophy, right? Some of those guiding principles to be able to hone and teach those students. Because I agree with what you're doing with the Raven tribe, that you have to make someone a better human being. And ultimately, the martial art is for that. It's to make that human being a better self, right? You take whatever raw material that he comes off with and you make him a better them, right? So it goes back to philosophy as well, like Plato's philosophy, turning that base metal into gold, right? Alchemy. That's basically what you're doing with a human being now.
Great. Now, Pablo, if people are in the Houston area and they want to reach out to you for lessons, weekly lessons, or if somebody across the country wants to bring you out for, seminars and workshops, how can they get a hold of you?
Well, the best way to, of course, to kind of get a hold of me is they can get a hold of me through Facebook, the Raven Tribe as well, or many of the instructors that I'm basically certified under, my information will be under that guidelines right there, so they can actually reach me. I haven't developed a website per se or anything like that, but like we talked about, already, that one of the things that I do want to do is basically start doing this more publicly. I have basically taught a lot of people through friends and friends of friends, and even done some seminars as well because of people that already know me. But I think it's time for me to kind of put myself out there and put it out in the public, maybe write a book, do some videos, make a public website. So, it's situations like this that actually makes me believe that maybe the public is ready for some of this information. Because not reality-based martial arts, which is basically a category of what I'm teaching, is not always for everybody, right? Some people prefer the sports, right? Prefer classical martial arts. So that's actually one of the things that has been holding me back from actually putting it out there, because it's not always for everybody. But maybe it is time, especially the situations that we're dealing with now with terrorism and just the sheer, intensity of violence that's out there. So maybe it's time for reality base to kind of get stay out there.
Great. Well, Pablo, thank you for being on the show with us today. Hopefully we'll get you back in the future, and be safe. Thank you again very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.